Welcome to this episode of Artists Talk. This is the voice of Gabrielle Gatchalian, recording from New York City. This conversation with Jed Gregorio took place via a series of Zoom calls in September 2020. This recording is composed of 3 sessions combined. The first recorded on September 10, the second in September 12, and the third in September 18 Eastern Time. To begin, allow me to introduce Jed Gregorio. He is an artist, filmmaker, writer, and poet. Presently, he lives and works in Manila in the Philippines. In 2019, I worked with him as the curator of his first solo exhibition, held in the First United Building, originally the Edificio Luis Perez Manilio, a pre-war Art Deco building in Escolta, Manila, recognized as an important cultural property by the National Historical Commission. The exhibition, titled New Frontiers in the Evolution of the Blood of the Immortal Poets, is at the heart of a quasi-narrative, world-building project that has unfolded over multiple other exhibitions, screenings, and printed matter, both predating and succeeding the Escolta show. The latest juncture in the Immortal Poets body of work is the multi-iterative piece titled Godhood, recently shown in the Kyoto City University of Arts in Kyoto, Japan. The following conversation is the first in-depth interview with Jed Gregorio about his practice and body of work since actively pursuing exhibitioning in 2017. Timestamps for the different parts of the conversation are provided in the description below. Yeah, so like the first time we met, you were working on the rock catalog at 98B. And like from what I understood at that time, you were kind of new to doing art yourself?
Yes.
No? Like when did you get started?
My first, the first work I exhibited was a work called Compost. That was like, it's an exhibition called Fuck Art, Let's Dance. It's like a one-night exhibition in 2020. I think what happened actually there was I wasn't really part of it. I mean, I wasn't really gonna be part of it. A friend was invited to show work, and I think he didn't want to show work, so he told me about it. And then I had this idea of working with soil somehow. And when I thought about just the context of that whole show, it just made sense because it was gonna be, it was a work that somehow made sense in that setting because it was supposed to be dark, it was supposed to be loud. So yeah. And that work is actually directly related to the rock catalog work because when I was talking to Maui for the 98B show, she invited me to show Compost. But then I told her that it's not gonna work there. So that's what happened. Like I had to propose new work, and then I had this other idea with the rocks, and yeah, that's where that work came from. But I only started like pursuing exhibitioning as a practice in 2017. Before that, I've been wanting to do it for a while, but I kind of didn't really know how to start, or I didn't really know how to just get into it. So what I did was, since I had friends who were editors in CNN, I asked them if I could be an art writer. I wanted to write about art as just as personal research for what was happening. I've been going to some exhibitions, things like that, but I wanted to engage with it more formally. There were artists that I wanted to talk to and have a reason to talk to. So that was useful. And it's interesting because some people who met me for the first time thought I was a journalist or something. I mean, I was kind of, it was a journalistic enterprise in some way, but the motivation for it was largely personal. Like I really wanted to learn and just see how I could start doing exhibitions because when I graduated, I mostly worked in magazines, and then it soon, just after a while of doing that, it became it became clear to me that it wasn't as a kind of articulation or as a kind of self-expression. Just writing or publishing work wasn't enough. It had to be something else. So yeah, the rock catalog work was I think the second work of installation I've done.
A lot of a lot of folks who are in art, have this sort of idea that you have to go to art school. I mean, that's an idea. I mean, that's a thought that a lot of people have, and they end up like going that route uh, in an attempt to sort of pursue this. Um, so, like, I think a lot of what quite a number of folks don't know is some people, there are other avenues in, and that's not like the only path you can take into it. And I think that the perspective and coming in from somebody who doesn't come from that background, like formally, like with a degree or anything, like it makes for a lot of it makes for a lot more variety in that,
Yeah, yeah.
which is great. Did you ever think that you needed to go to art school at any point, or like was
No,
there any urge for that?
yeah. Well, my background. I mean, I did study. I did have like a liberal arts education. It's not like I
Mhm.
had like a science degree or something. So a lot of what I know come from that background. I guess it's different from, let's say, like a fine arts degree, like a studio arts degree. That's not the kind of engagement mm, I'm familiar with. But in terms of approaching my work now, of course it has a lot to do with the education I've had. And I studied film in college, so a lot of that is also what I do now. It's kind of like, if you think about it, it's kind of like I didn't not come from an arts background. I think that's kind of like a
Mhm.
misconception because I kind of did.
Yeah, yeah.
Not the studio arts that I know some of my friends did do. And I think it was useful. I learned a lot studying philosophy and humanities and things like this. I mean I would
And to be
I
honest,
would
like I
rec
think that
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
like I would recommend it if anyone asked me about that.
The rock catalog, was that something that you always had an idea for, or was that more of like a response to a prompt that you were given, or because you were saying that like you were invited
Yeah,
to
I guess
show
the yeah,
another
yeah,
work.
yeah. I think the rock catalog in its final form in Escolta was a response, but
Mhm.
the idea for it was much earlier on. The because like I sketch ideas, like I draw almost every day. And these are usually ideas for either composition, for I don't know, some are scenes for films, some are ideas for photography, and then some are models for installation. And I've had this idea for a while of rocks on basically rocks on a shelf, or some kind of display device. And I think the earlier idea were a lot of much smaller, more rocks. And when Maui showed me the spot I was gonna be given to mount the work, kind of like that that entrance space in Hub, I thought the sculpture had to be much bigger. It had to be a much bigger installation because it was gonna be like the first thing you see when you enter the exhibition space, and that's how the final form of it developed. Like I knew it had to be a much bigger shelf than I first planned. They had to be much bigger rocks, and because they were much bigger rocks, they could be fewer rocks. And thinking about it as kind of like a display, specifically in that spot, that's kind of like how the composition of it came about, like with the four lights illuminating it from the sides. Yeah.
That rock catalog, what was the idea behind it?
I mean, even me, I have a hard time trying to figure out where where some ideas come from, because I think there's so many ways that you can talk about that work. I remember someone specifically commenting it's derivative of like an arte povera kind of sensibility, which I mean I guess you can look at it that way. I think at that time I wasn't even aware of that. But one way you could also look at it was the work of someone starting out, or someone trying to work with material, or someone trying to, how do you say it, like someone trying to have a familiarity with material. I mean, I knew for example that it wasn't, if we were talking about materials, I knew that it wasn't going to be paint, because you know I don't really have a relationship with that as a material or canvas. I really had to think of it more in terms of what belongs to me, or what, I don't know, what I feel comfortable working with. You know, if you look at works like, if you look at those two works, Compost and Rock Catalog, that it's soil and rocks with a component of like light, electrical light. I just thought, I guess at that time, that these were things that did not belong to anyone in particular or belong to everyone. And these are things that you can kind of like claim ownership to, and at the same time not. Another part of it is also the availability of what I was working with. Like I didn't really have, honestly, I didn't have a lot of money that time. Like much of the money went into transporting it. Like honestly, like that's where the money went. Like not really the thing themselves. Some of those I already had, or I asked from people, like the wooden pallets. I asked from someone I knew who had them. So also there's also that idea of the availability, and you know it being free. For some reason, I was conceptually drawn to that idea that I didn't have to spend, or I could claim ownership to an idea without really having to, I don't know, spend money to buy what needed to be built. I mean, that was the background of the work. What I proposed about the work is like an entirely different story, because of course, you know, this idea is really, how do you pitch it, right? Or how do you explain that you want to put rocks on a shelf for an exhibition? I mean, it's hard. Or I mean, at least I couldn't find the words to though justify it. So I had to come up with this quasi narrative about what it was. That's kind of like where the idea of the rock catalog came from. Because one of the things I wrote in the proposal was, this would be a project that would catalog all of the world's rocks, and these are just 7 of them, and that's why it's incomplete, because the complete rock catalog has yet to be made. And because of that proposal, you know, that's where the lecture performance arose. The lecture performance was a way of really talking about the work, talking about that that fictitious endeavor called the complete rock catalog, and what it would take to accomplish that.
I think contrary to what maybe some folks might think, and this is what I thought also, like when I was, getting into this, it's a lot of finishedness when it's not. A lot of this stuff is sort of a process ongoing and just discovering, what works for you and working around interests.
Yeah, yeah. I'm actually amazed at people who have like very clear cut plans about stuff, because I'm like, I mean, I kind of knew what I wanted, but at the same time, it's like, you wake up the next day and something could be different. And I feel like the art should be able to, it should be as complex and also in some ways as chaotic as the human that
Yeah.
initiates it. I wasn't really thinking of like categories where it would fit. As the art, as the person looking at the art, you can make evaluations of it based on however many criteria you want that suits your agenda. But as I said, as an early work for me, it was also like a it also had this symbolic function of functioning as a kind of manifesto, like laying the ground for what I plan to do and what I want to talk about. And I think starting with the soil and the rocks is a very literal, if you think about it, it's a very literal notion of a bedrock, or like kind of like laying the foundations, like literally.
Yeah, it's
Um,
quite Genesis, honestly.
yeah, 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 right. And I think what I was thinking about during that time was, like, for example, with the work compost, it's like my first work, but in many ways it will also be the last, because that's how we all end up as worm food. It's kind of prophetic, it's prophetic of everything.
Like, what sort of interests kind of drive the work
Yeah.
that you do? Because you were looking at the soil and the rocks, and we haven't even like gone to the other things yet. But here already, it's a lot of stuff that has to do with earth.
Yeah.
In
With those two works, the way I see it is that they have something to do with the earth insofar as everything is on earth. I think I've told you before that, for example, doing the rock catalog, of course I was reading a lot about geology, but at the end of the day, it's not really about geology, because I'm not a scientist. At least the rock, because you're talking about interests, right? I think the rock catalog, at least as a thought experiment, began there. How do you, because the question is, how do you accomplish a complete rock catalog, right? How do you catalog all of the earth's rocks, considering that the rock cycle is continuous, and rocks break down into a million sediments. So basically, what would a hyper live, hyper responsive rock catalog look like? One of the things you might think about it is that it's impossible, right? So I think, as a thought experiment, one of the things I had to think about was to prove it's possible. One of the ways I talked about it, at least in the lecture performance, is to prove that it's not infinite, because the earth is one piece of rock. Like, if you have a big enough box, you can fit the earth inside it. So if you can fit the entire earth into one box, it means it's contained. Like, the entire earth is its own rock catalog. The entire earth is its own complete rock catalog. Yeah, step number one was to prove that it wasn't infinite. That it wasn't the rock catalog is can be contained, because I was able to establish that this infinity aspect, or in talking about how the infinite is embedded inside rocks, or in talking about rocks, I can talk about infinity. It dawned on me basically that I can talk about anything. In talking about infinity, or like this eternal boundlessness, I can talk about anything I want. To answer your question about interests, it's anything I want. Like, honestly, you know what I mean? Like, the that's what I meant about the rock catalog functioning as a kind of manifesto, because as an as a work, that one of the first work I've done, at least for me personally, what that said was, after this I can talk about anything.
It's definitely where it's certainly where the humanities background comes in.
Yeah, isn't it kind of
it's,
obvious? But yeah.
it's the positing of questions, which is a good way to. It's a fun way, certainly, to like approach the work. Not as objects that need to be finished, but as questions to be asked. So it
Yeah, but
sort of
but yeah,
keeps
my
it.
my but also my other point is that even as an object, at least I think there's something compelling about it. You know what I mean? One of the things I got asked was, are they real rocks? It was so funny for me because I honestly can't make fake rocks. I don't know how. So there's kind of like this whole, of course, this whole fascinating ways of thinking you can engage it with, but I honestly don't think they're necessary. I think as an object, as a work, there's something about it that, I mean, at least for me, if it was pure concept, it wouldn't have been as fun. Working with those rocks, especially on my own, was really so much physical endurance.
I can imagine, certainly.
So I think at least it's important for me to engage it both ways, right? The rock catalog is on one spectrum, like a thought experiment, but also on the other spectrum, it's really about, it also has to do with the fragility of myself, and how much I can carry, or the weight of the world, so to speak, that the work carries, it, just by being itself, if that makes sense.
You're saying that it was like the question is, how do you accomplish a complete rock catalog, and the narrative behind it is asking sort of question. Are you much interested in science fiction?
Yeah, you know what? I'm I think I'm gonna answer that the same way, that I'm interested in science fiction insofar that I think everything is science fiction,
Mm-hmm.
honestly. Or at least the lens from which I view the world is that. It's kind of like the wildest conjectures we have about the future of humanity. I don't know. I don't know what to say, because I'm not really like a scientist. I mean, I'm just a science fiction fan. I guess the what I can talk about in terms of that is, what I do like about science fiction is the boundlessness of the imagination. Yeah, I don't have many interesting things to say about that. Or maybe I'm sorry. Later, I'll go back to it later.
Yeah, that's plenty interesting in the
Yeah,
boundlessness of imagination,
yeah,
which is it keeps the work free. Keeps the work
yeah.
fun and genuine. Even the last time that we worked together, I was scouting locations for you for New Frontiers, and
Yes.
there you were also sort of trying to write a bit of a fiction.
Yeah, 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 yeah. The I think the New Frontier show, I think one of the main starting points of it was Escolta, right?
Mm.
I think that was really one of the main characters of that show, so to speak. I remember also one of the things we really kept on talking about during that time, I remember, was my grandmother, right? Because we did that in 2019. My grandmother died the year before, so she couldn't have seen it. I think for me, I don't know. There was kind of like there's an affinity. I have an affinity for Escolta both as a real place and also a fictional place. Like my grandmother was born in 1927, and the first United building was completed in 1928. So, I have this imagination of like when my grandmother was a baby, there was also this structure rising up from the ground nearby because we're also from Manila. And just these you know, just these connections for me are fascinating. Or for example, the fact that it's the architect for First United was Andres Luna, right? The son of Juan Luna. I know he was born in Paris. He lived there until he was like 6 years old. But he was born in Paris before the turn of the century. So you can only imagine, like, Paris during the Belle Epoque and what that does to a young boy. I mean, honestly, it's something I could never know and something I could only dream of. So I guess I'm also fascinated by that. It's this kind of like very vague French connection inside the work that, of course, I love. You know, you asked about like a fictional narrative. It's fictional, but also it's kind of like bound with a history that's far from fictional. So yeah, those are things that interest me when these two things intermingle. Like some of the most compelling fictions have such resonance with reality, and that's what makes them great stories because they could almost be real.
That's something interesting to think about. These sort of alternate places, like alternate timelines that we sometimes imagine, when we think about places, spaces, and moments that we were never in but can only imagine, both past and present. And it's interesting too because like your rock catalog work, that's it's a bit future thinking if you think about it. Like because you'd have to, it involves sort of asking the questions: how do you accomplish a complete rock catalog? Because this is something that is ongoing. Like the Earth just kind of just keeps making this stuff, you know, as part of its process. And then when you look at the work that you did for New Frontiers, it's a lot of thinking about, and it's interesting because these are things bound to the Earth too, like physical uh,
Right.
places bound to the Earth. And here you're thinking about a place that has quite a bit of a long past. And even here, like you were also sort of dealing with the future with the work you were doing with the documentarist in
Yeah.
Miller's Planet. And I
Yeah.
remember when you were approaching the tour, like I remember you mentioning that a way to approach it was that the video work is something that you see like as somebody from the future looking at a work about the past. I think that was some very interesting play going on there, and it's a way to engage. It's a form of fiction. It's a form of science fiction.
Yeah.
I think quite.
I think what another thing I guess I like about science fiction, or calling it that, or recognizing it as a genre, is it kind of belongs to the public in a friendlier way than contemporary art, I think. Just look at how many Star Wars fans you have. That's one aspect of it, I think, that I like, that it's accessibility, that it's understandability, that when you say that, because I think the New Frontiers show is not really science fiction. It's kind of like science fiction that doesn't have science. It's like, but I think if you do propose reading it as a work of science fiction, I think there's something there, that there's something valuable there, because immediately it becomes accessible. Kind of start looking for characters, for example, or your suspension of disbelief. I don't know. You dream more, you imagine more, as opposed to if you were engaging with a piece of contemporary art academically. It's more fun. I think
Yeah.
that's what I like about it. Yeah.
it's interesting too. Rock Catalog was your second work, and then like New Frontiers comes a little bit after. And so far, it's also started to look like just even up at that point, it's as if the work that you do is a series. And I think I asked you before if this was something that you planned out, if it was something that was a continuing thought.
Yeah. The serial nature of the work, I think I honestly want to say I planned it, but I didn't. Or I think the way I see it, a biography as an object is serial in its nature, meaning anyone who makes work after the end of their life, their body of work somehow forms some kind of series. And it kind of becomes part of the world to look into that body of work and how they connect. In that way, it is a series because I think everything could be read as series. But I get what you mean. Like the work I did after the rock catalog was this work. What was this work called The Lover, and was the lover was really a conscious turn to make it intentionally serial. Like when I showed The Lover, I knew that it was just the beginning of something. With Rock Catalog, I wasn't thinking about that. I was really thinking, the way I thought about that work was, as a singular project that I have to accomplish within this time. With The Lover, that was a conscious turn. Actually, I do remember when I showed The Lover, it was shown with the works water and dead fish preserved, which were the sardine cans in a glass box. My friends of mine who went to the show didn't know that those were my work because, other work I've done before that they've seen were the rocks in the soil. So what do you expect next, right? And I think it wasn't that wasn't the kind of work they were expecting to see, I think. Which I like because, I don't want to be predictable. So beginning with The Lover, it became a lot more intentional that it's gonna be a series. That apart from seeing the work unfold in a space or like a gallery space or a site specific space or whatever, I wanted it to also unfold across time. Meaning that sometimes I would do work that are just clues for the next work. Sometimes it's more of like a backwards kind of thing where how they say art imitates life, and then you see like like a ready-made, say, a urinal inside a gallery, so it started from real life and it became art. With, for example, the work Water, for example, the idea for the water bottles presented like that started in the gallery first as a um, kind of like a work inside a vacuum. It doesn't really tell you anything. And then in New Frontiers, you see their function. You see the functions of the water bottles as a kind of votive, or I don't know what's another word for votive, but something you leave at an altar or like at a holy place or something. So in that way, it functions retroactively. Their function is revealed across time. I mean, in that sense, the serial nature of it is a lot more intentional. And again, whether or not you make the connections, for me, is not that significant. You could see the water bottles on their own, and I think appreciate something about them, or you can see the work ghosts recorded by technologies across time with the water bottles there on its own without knowing anything I've done before, and I don't know, maybe see something there.
I was actually about to ask about ghosts. About ghosts recorded. You used soil in that one too, with the water. I remember we were talking about how that whole thing was supposed to be. It was supposed to be presented as something that was living, in the sense that it was implied that there's a caretaker who waters the soil.
I mean, one of the things, I want to go back to Andres Luna, the architect of First United. It was originally not called First United, right? But imagine this architect building this place and thinking about this alcove underneath the stairs. That's what attracted me to that spot. This little cupboard underneath the stairs is like the complete antithesis of the Kunsthal, or the kind of like the big art gallery. It's kind of like this inconsequential spot, but I do sometimes think about Andres Luna building this building, and I don't know, thinking about this alcove and what this alcove will be used for in the future, or what significance or lack thereof it will have in the world. And it's funny that we're now talking about it, right? We're now talking about that dingy little corner. It's kind of like an insignificant spot, but acknowledging its significance, like, how do you do that? How do you divert your attention to the the grand art deco structures of Escolta Street to a little dark cupboard underneath the stairs? So I really began to imagine that spot as like a foundation stone, but instead of a stone, a foundational small patch of soil where on which everything was built. And the goal of the goal of the exhibition, as it were, is to sustain the life of that little patch of soil. So the alcove underneath the stairs becomes a kind of incubator. It becomes a kind of incubator, so that the soil remains alive. Of course, whatever that means is another story, but the that's what really drew me to that spot. I mean, the spots we chose in Escolta, in First United, were special. They're kind of like the opposites of each other. Like, one was in the ground floor, this kind of like on this really small spot, and then one was kind of like upstairs. So they kind of exist in opposite poles of First United as a building. But what I want to do with the exhibition is kind of like really unite them, and uh, you know, I don't know, they don't feel so apart anymore.
I mean, the space downstairs was a broom closet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And the space upstairs was in, it's mundane as well. It's an attic used for storage just as well, but
yeah,
it's not as actually. It's not like you pass by it all the time, which we certainly do with the broom closet downstairs.
yeah. And
Um,
I don't know if you remember, but the first time you showed me the upstairs, like, I just immediately fell in love with it. I really loved it so much. Like, I don't know if you remember that moment, but I do. Like, when I saw it, I thought, this is it. It's like, the ideas belong here. And then it's crazy because it was like so dirty. It was so messy. It was jam packed with a bunch of things. But I don't know. There was something about it that transported me back in time, and I don't want to say, but it really feels like it was for me.
no, I completely get that. Actually, when I saw it, I was like, I think he's gonna like this one.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
crazy. I felt like a real estate,
yeah,
person like showing you all this stuff. And this is,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you
uh,
so much. Because I didn't know about it before, but I think that was what was great about it. Because, like, from our conversations, you knew what I wanted. You knew the spirit of the project, and you brought me there. I don't know. I guess that's where curatorship comes in. These are things that I wouldn't really have thought of on my own, but when it's presented and it's now kind of like my job to respond, that's when it begins.
happy that this is really, quite site specific. There's really, yeah, to transport any of those would be that'd be
Yeah,
it's a bit of a
yeah,
hunt, to try to do that.
yeah,
Would you that was that something that you'd be interested in doing in the future? Like, this is something I thought about too, because it is site specific. If you were invited to exhibit this work again in another place, like, Would that be something you'd be interested in doing, like a place maybe completely different from Escolta?
Yeah, I mean the you know
And seeing how.
for example, I did the first rock catalog in 2018, and then when I
Mhm.
was asked to show it again this year in an art gallery, I did show it, but it was something else. So I think the if that kind of opportunity arises, the the work is site specific, but I'm not. You know what I mean? Like how do you put it in like a radically different spot? I guess that gesture itself becomes part of the story of the work. It's kind of
Mm.
transportation. This transportation is a very interesting. It's a very interesting thing. This dislocation. As I said earlier, retroactively, you can really you can really look at the work water in the art gallery as a dislocation of an idea. Ghosts recorded by technologies across time was site specific, but you have the same components. Actually, not all the same components, but one component of it, kind of like uh, disattached from that and dislocated. So yeah, I think that would be interesting. I will see.
It's actually quite nice to see where you started and see like how these like ideas and processes started to sort of grow as you went along, because it is a lot of echoing, like a just interesting, but it's useful to know that it's not always like a super deliberate thing. Ideas grow from projects conceived and executed in the past. And I mean, like you and yeah, that's certainly something you did with a triptych in Limbo.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like
I think
that's would you consider that like a dislocation?
yeah, interesting.
Or like a new
Yeah, I mean you did mention deliberateness,
thing?
or yeah, the if you think about it, they're very deliberate to a point, right? For example, the plastic canopy in the remedial bequest that is covered in dust, which was actually baby powder. That was kind of deliberate. That was very deliberate to conceal it further. And that act of concealment wasn't just concealment for the sake of it, but concealment as a symbolic act, kind of alerting the viewer that it's hiding something. Because the reliquary the reliquary object is empty. The documentarist in Miller's Planet, the film, shows it as having contents, but the one upstairs is empty. I thought that you had to hide that, you had to hide that fact, because an empty reliquary is an empty vessel does not contain the holy relics, right? And we have
Mhm.
to hide that. There is a train of thought within the process where I don't attempt to make deliberate connections, but when it comes down to the work itself, it's very deliberate. I think with the limbo triptych in particular, that work did start from a curatorial prompt. It was a group show that talked about trauma that can be inherited through generations, or a trauma that is not yours but you recognize. I mean, you as the curator of the New Frontier show, we never talked about that, right? But when I do mention it now, it makes so much sense to look at the work, to look back at the work from that lens, because the New Frontier show is really a lot of, at least for me, I was thinking a lot about grief. I was talking about the secret dream of these group of guys, or I'm thinking about the faith you put in keeping the patch of soil alive, and the amount of care it needs to be sustained. All of these things, these seemingly disparate things. And so with the limbo triptych, it was really a chance to go back also in showing photographs. I think photography is a big part of my practice. So showing showing those photos that came from producing the New Frontiers show kind of made it I'm not sure, it's like your question was it like an act of dislocation, right? I think, maybe what's interesting about showing photography is you can now show the site specific work somewhere else, and its objecthood as a photograph informs that gesture. What I mean to say is when you look at say photography of say landscapes or interiors or people, it's already culturally informed what they function as. You know what I mean? So for example, you see a portrait of a young man. Be- Before looking at the content of the portrait, it's being a portrait, it's already something. You know, it's already it's already part of its identity as an object. Also, its scale, it's already a part of it. You know how like family photos are small little memories, and then of course product billboards are these massive massive things. The limbo triptych was also an attempt to really reframe some of the elements from that show, and I guess further problematize it, honestly. For example, in the in part 3 Miller's Planet, you don't really get to know any of the guys. You just see them. There's 5 of them. You don't really know who they are. And in the limbo triptych, you see one of them as a single portrait. It's an act of dislocation, but at the same time, also an act of making a new location, or like making new foundations for that work.
I didn't even get to go to Limbo to see that. When I heard about it, when I saw the pictures of the pictures, uh,
Yeah.
that was that was really I don't know, that was really fun for me too, to sort of just think about that, because I mean, New Frontiers is a bit of a play in, pretend it was something imagined, like the whole thing, like especially when we were doing the tours, we were trying to treat it as, giving a tour of like an imagined version of these places. Like, there's a caretaker that takes care of, the soil downstairs. There's a reliquary, upstairs, and to sort of treat it as, like as a living thing, as if they are,
Yes.
artifacts that were always there. And it was really interesting to me when you presented the photos at Limbo, because that's what happens with actual historical sites anyway. Like there's pictures taken of them, and then the discussion around these places continues. Like when it's in a book, when it's in a zine, when it's exhibited.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. You basically explained it in a much more straightforward way than I could.
Oh my god, we never even.
Yeah.
So when I saw that, I was like, wow.
That's exact that's exactly what I wanted to say.
That was exciting for me because my mom has a collection of, books about religious sites and just sites in general all over the Netherlands, all over Europe. And it's fun to, like see, pictures of these places, and you hear about the stories. You're so far away from it, but, you see that, and, it's a means for you to sort of be transported. But, and the same thought also occurs to me. It's like, I'm never going to be, like, these books are from the 70s. I'm never going to be in,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Netherlands in the 70s. So, like, this is what we have. And it's interesting that this is, it's an imagined
yeah,
version of reality, where
yeah.
we're just
And I
thinking
think,
like these
with
Netherlands.
those photos, because one of the first things we talked about for the New Frontiers show was to imagine the act of going to galleries, or the act of going to exhibitions as comprising of coord- somehow coordinates. So there's the visiting public, there's the site, and imagining these coordinates as being a parallel of holy pilgrimages, right?
Mhm.
So you have a bunch of people traveling and wanting to see this spot. That was that was actually one of the ways we talked about that show. In going to that exhibit, it's like we're choreographing a holy pilgrimage, right? Escolta is kind of like in the heart of Manila, but at the same time you have to intentionally go there. It's not like you just pass it. You know what I mean? Like you have to really plan to go there to be able to be there.
And going back to New Frontiers for a little bit, since we were
Sure.
talking about it being like a pilgrimage site, and one thing I wanted to highlight and ask about also is the fact that there is a barrier for the reliquary. And it's full of these things. It's again like a more that pilgrimage stuff. And I remember it was and the thing there was that it was imagined pilgrims leaving things of meaning to them. Uh,
Yeah.
As an act of pilgrimage, as an act of prayer to some extent, I suppose, and tribute.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you put lyrics of pop songs.
Yeah. I think the idea with the barricade to that area was, on one level, we also don't want people to like go there because we weren't sure of the structural integrity of the platform. But also, as I said, thinking about the reliquary as an object, it's meant to it's meant to protect something inside it, right? There's already that one layer. There's already that that's the first barricade, and then, in contemporary art language, you put photos in frames or put sculptures in glass vitrines. In the same way, in the remedial bequest, there's kind of like that plastic canopy that is supposed to protect it. So that's the second barrier. The sign that says do not go beyond this point, it seems like the first barrier, but it's already actually the third. You know what I mean? And then during the course of the exhibition, when the door was closed and you can only see it through a peephole, that's the fourth. It's kind of like these layer of barriers that I think, granting access to the work made it difficult. But at the same time, we both know it's empty. There's actually nothing to see inside it. So in many ways, these are actually really barriers for nothing. With the pop songs written on the little pieces of bus tickets, cigarette boxes. What I wanted to do was really turn that barrier space into its own thing, almost like a resistance against it. So it's stopping you from going forward, but it's also where you can leave something behind. And the I think the idea for writing pop songs, I think I remember describing pop songs or pop lyrics as fragments of, they're kind of like fragments of humanity that are sufficiently vague but also very specific. It's like if you hear a song, you feel like it's about you. But and then you feel like it's exactly talking about your life, and then billions of other people think the same thing. For me, that's such a fascinating phenomenon. I These pop songs were kind of like, that's the way I imagined them. They represent very specific things, but at the same time, very vague things. Almost like prayers. Sometimes prayers are very specific prayers, and then you pray for good health, things like that. Actually, if I can highlight like one song, like one of them, it says there, I think, I don't dance now. It's from a Cardi B song. I think it's Bodak Yellow, right? Like she,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
she, yeah, yeah. I don't dance now, like I make money moves. So it's kind of like this, this statement about, I'm not the person who I was anymore. That's what it says. This is something, it's so specific to Cardi B, but also something we can say about ourselves.
that was something I really remember about like that particular thing also. And
I think I also have a very, like, my relationship with, going back to your earlier question about interests. I really don't separate interests from what is kind of like high art and, pop culture, whatever.
yep.
It's They're all the same to me. Like, the categories don't come first, but something else comes first. I don't know what you call it. some kind of non-cerebral recognition of someone else's humanity. You know what I mean? That's what's important.
Going back to, I just made this connection now too, but remember you saying that somebody asked you if you made the rocks, and it's interesting because when you were setting up the reliquary, you made the dust, so you did make the rocks
Yeah.
this time. It's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I also another aspect of the dust was its smell. You know, the baby powder smell is such a familiar smell. And I think it's also it makes for a slightly incongruous experience to go up there and it's so dusty, but it smells like baby, right?
That's, I mean, that's something that also happens with a lot of these pilgrimage sites too. There's this whole thing with these places smelling like roses, roses here, roses there, roses everywhere. And it's interesting that in your case, it's baby powder. So, like, it's. I mean, like, was that deliberate also? Like, were you thinking about that?
Yeah, yeah. We talked a lot about death, right, in New Frontiers, and the remedial bequest in particular is like when I showed the photo of the remedial bequest in Limbo, it was called Shrine for the Living because I know shrines of the dead are never really for the dead. They're really for us to remember the dead, right? So it's a work about death, but I think what we associate with this baby powder smell is a very it also becomes a work about rebirth because of the smell, or it becomes a work that kind of returns to infancy. Yeah, so within the work is kind of like the beginning and the end.
Yeah, scoot back over to Limbo once again. I'm curious, since the work was about work that had been done before, what kind of questions were you getting about, the photographs from people who were there and from people who weren't there for, the original
Yeah,
installations?
yeah. I you know what? I remember being so exhausted during opening night because I talked to so many people, and then you have to talk louder because of the music. But
Yeah, oh my god, like,
yeah, I did remember, for example, the first portrait. The first portrait is the figure of the lover, right? If you recognize it. But the title of the photo was Angel of Small Death. I was asked if it's a painting, or I guess people didn't really recognize it as a photograph, or someone asked me if it was CGI, and it's not. It's really it's a raw, untouched photo because the in the documentaries in Miller's Planet, part one, the lover was lit using blue light. Like someone asked me if that was the moon. It's not. It's like a blue bulb, or it's a bulb covered with blue cellophane. And then about the middle photo, Shrine for the Living, I was asked if it was like a real place. Of course, the answer to that is yes and also no, right? Uh, the I was also asked if it was a miniature. You know, um, that was interesting because if you were able to go there and experience it and know the size of it in relation to the size of your own body, it's fascinating that someone can see a photo and think it's a miniature. I mean, for me, that's so interesting. And then for the third portrait, Angelo, I guess people were just asking who he was, because he's not like he does photography. I mean, Jello does photography, but he's not like an exhibiting artist. Not very many people know him, so people who wanted to know who he was. Those those were questions I got asked, and I mean they're fascinating, because like for example with the question of the real place, how do I begin to explain the yes and the no, right? It's kind of like it's gonna be a 2-hour conversation.
okay, this is not necessarily about the work, but on Instagram, you often open, you often open up like the avenue for people to ask questions. When did that start?
Yeah,
And like since we're talking about that anyway.
I kind of just did it for fun one time,
Mhm.
and then I got a lot of questions from people I didn't know. And then I realized that a lot of them were like art students. And so I thought it will be helpful, I thought, to share just perspectives on things and try to be helpful. And in the process, kind of also a way of looking back at stuff I've done and just rethinking about them because you do forget them. It's really so useful to go back and look at what you've done and try to look back at how the raw impulses could evolve into a very complex constellation of things that are beyond personal.
I think that's what I meant. Like when I was asking earlier, what are the interests that drive these work? That word impulses. That's a place where these things can begin. In terms of making the work, in terms of conceiving ideas, impulses.
Yeah. Because I think what I want to retain from that original impulse is the energy. Sometimes you think of ideas and then they seem great. They seem great, but then when you look back at the idea, it sucks. But actually, the energy from that moment of thinking about that is what I want to go back to. Maybe not the idea per se, but the naivete from which that idea sprung could be interesting, or the amount of caffeine during that time. I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, but I think we talked about this before as well. You were saying that the work that you did originally, like your earlier work, is like you didn't quite say if it was like a version of you in the past that would.
Yeah. I think what I might have said was, I think I remember what I said. I think what I said was, sometimes you do things. For example, I did compost in 2017. It's been 3 years now. So I think it's fair to say that I'm not exactly the same person I was back then, but whoever that person was onto something. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of like how I think about it, and so it's important to safeguard that idea or do not abandon that idea. You know what I mean? I think that's where also the serial nature of the practice comes from. It's because I never want to abandon ideas that I feel like aren't yet, that I can still explore, or that I've left behind something.
So the way that your work unfolds, it's almost as if this sort of wholeness to it. It's a bit instinctive to you, is what I seem to be observing. Like the way that it harks back when you move forward with the addendum, something new. Because it really leads into the.
I honestly think like everything I do is like one big Freudian slip. You know what I mean? Like I never. I mean, I have some hope of what to communicate, but ultimately, what comes out is beyond me. I guess that's why I mean that's why I hope we have more like critics or writers to engage with, because honestly I feel like you could come up with more interesting things about what I do than I can. That's what I mean when I say I don't like explaining things. It's like I can talk about things, like if you ask me something about it, I'll answer it, but it's never like I'm explaining it, because I honestly also don't know what it is. I can only talk around it and kind of like tell you a bunch of things, and if you're really intuitive, like maybe you can make connections, and that's what I hope happens.
Which is certainly what has been happening, like with the kinds of questions you were getting for Limbo, with and for the triptych in Limbo, and for everything really.
Another reason why I keep calling it Limbo Triptych, even if that's not really the title, is like Limbo is like this. Limbo is limbo in two ways, so it makes perfect sense as a name.
That's the second Incomplete Rock catalog. At what point in the timeline was that?
So the Incomplete Rock catalog of 2020, it's like subtitled Broken Monument Configuration 0. I did that this year for a group show. It was a group show that included artists whose practices somehow involves collecting rubble. I was asked to do the rock catalog there. So that was this year. That was in March in Art Informal. Actually, when I was asked about it, I was asked first if the rock catalog is intact, and then I just said yes, and then I realized some of the components somehow got lost in storage. Like basically, I can't build it the exact way. For example, I can't find the original floodlight, and I was for some reason I was losing one of the planks for the shelf, and one of the rocks, original rocks, I lost one of the rocks. And then I realized at one point that, I can show a different work and call it the same thing. We were talking earlier about how when I did it in 2018, I was really thinking about it also like it also functioned as a manifesto. So it would also be like a great opportunity to, like, I guess in the same way, reconfigure the manifesto. So instead of, for example, building the structure upwards, the second rock catalog work, it was built horizontally instead of vertically. I was looking also a lot at, the floor plans of Egyptian tombs, or drawings of Egyptian tombs, and how I think what they do then, they were meant for the pharaohs, right? And some of these burial chambers were small. So what they did was they took apart carriages, they took apart boats to make them fit inside so that they can be used for the afterlife. If you looked at these drawings of these Egyptian tombs, there are a series of chambers and antechambers and like passageways. And of course, the how the things were arranged inside had to conform to those specifics. The way the second rock catalog work was arranged was kind of like that. Like imagining, I don't know, like an oddly shaped perimeter for it. And in that way, also, it was the first time I made work that I didn't know how it would look like in its final form because I can't set it up at home. It's a bit too big. So what I did was I tried certain configurations of certain parts and took photos. Some of them I sketched just to see what they would look like. But the final form in the gallery, it just happened when we were setting it up. Because I also didn't know what spot I was getting and how big of a spot I was getting. So the work had to be adaptable in that way. One of the things I changed about that work compared to the 2018 version was, even if it was a still unmoving thing, it was running on fuel. It was running on this fuel of carbonated beverage, basically, of carbonation, sugar, energy, right? So that's where the energy drink component came in. I think Art in the Park was gonna happen shortly after. So I also made work for Art in the Park before it got canceled. The Cobra work that was made using, I forgot what it's called. I think it's called Berry Mix. It's like the red variant of Cobra, but when you when you dip paper on it, it somehow becomes pink. So they are like these little. They're very small. I think they're about 10 cm. But I also envisioned them actually to. I tried it also like like a large scale projection. It looks like a series of landscapes or pink sand dunes. Thinking about that sand dune thing, somehow it also still relates. I guess you could say thematically to the rock catalog as a land, thinking about land, but not actually land, but liquid. So there's that thing. There's that there. So that was in March, to answer your question. The funny thing about it is I never thought I'd mount that work again. But having been asked to show it again was also a great opportunity to, you know, reconsider what I was thinking back in 2018, and in many ways change my mind. You know what I mean? Yeah.
It's quite amazing that there is, such a visible progression in your body of work that I think for the most part it's largely, like, would you say, like, unintentional? Like,
it's something that really just unfolds. The echoing of materials.
Right. Yeah. Because we were talking about we were talking earlier about, for example, the water bottle works, and I guess on some level I was also thinking about water, but jacked water. You know the milk like Bear brand, like the milk. I like they
Yeah,
call it something. Is it fortified milk or
yeah,
whatever?
fortified milk.
Yeah. So I was thinking about like a fortified liquid, but at the same time, too much of it is poison. Or when I started to think about, for example, the water bottles as a kind of offering, in the earlier work. I mean, even just the name Cobra, right? It's like I just remember you mentioned something Genesis, right? Like with the work. I guess,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess, yeah. I guess here's the snake. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I just thought of it now.
The human intervention. It's fascinating how a lot of this is like relative. It's like relatively unintentional. It's amazing, kind of like what goes on in the unconscious, like in terms of what ends up showing up and the connections you end up making, and like making these connections like without you deliberately doing so. Just thematically, a lot of it
Yeah.
fits.
Yeah, because I don't
And I'm
I never I mean I never really engage the work thematically on the onset. It's not like I decide
mhm.
these are the themes I'm gonna talk about. It I think it more has to do with, for example, with Cobra. Like one aspect that I'm drawn to are the advertisements, like narratives of like an empowered workforce, or like visuals of like masculine figures who are like, unfazed by exhaustion, or as I said earlier, like the weight of the world, and here's this magic potion they can buy. And then for the raw catalog work, the reason I called it Broken Monument Configuration Zero was because I was thinking about, was it configuration zero in the sense that this is how it looks like before it was built, or is this broken monument in the sense that this is how it looks like after it's been destroyed? So it exists in like a limbo space. I mean, going back to that word again, like a suspended time place when you don't quite know whether this configuration is the past or the future. Is it telling you what things were, or is it telling you what are things to come?
This discussion about continuity and these questions that seem to sort of pop up in your work about the past, the present, and the future. And like you don't really go into these things necessarily with a very deliberate plan to connect. So it's also an interesting thing to notice that like there's so much in your body of work, so it also sort of lends to a very easy sort of piecing it together into a bit of a narrative even.
Yeah,
Like a continuum
I
and
wonder, like I wonder if it's easy indeed. I don't know.
I feel like for this like for this particular body work, like when I look through your portfolio and stuff, it does flow. And when you look at it, it makes sense, and it because with art history, and especially when art historians, art critics, curators sort of look at a particular artist's body of work, we're always like trying for one reason or another. We're always sort of a lot of sort of try to make sense of the timeline. By way of thinking about it through a lens of growth and aging sometimes, or things that influence an artist. Like a story sort of shows up. Even like you started with a rock catalog, and that was a bit more of like a question asked with no characters in it necessarily. And then when you did your solo show, all of a sudden there were some like there were human faces. There is a character. There are these sort of invisible people involved in the stories surrounding.
I do think about that sometimes, that aspect of how is the work understood. Ultimately, I can't say, right? I mean, I do sometimes wonder. For example, if someone sees one work and sees another work, will that person sense the, as you say, like the connection, or the, yeah, because I think it's not, I don't think so much, I don't think a lot about style. You know what I mean? Like there is no. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm making an accurate evaluation of my own work, but there is no the visual style, at least on the surface, is not immediately. It doesn't immediately jump out at you, or maybe it does. I don't know. But I'm sure you know what I mean, right? Like certain people have very specific ways of working with a visual language as we describe it. Like colors, I guess that's what I mean. Like colors, forms that are unique to them. On the whole, I am less encumbered by this.
Actually, style
Yeah.
can very much be a crutch for some people who feel like they absolutely must conform to what it is that they've sort of branded themselves as.
Yeah.
Um,
Actually, so
and
many
you know,
friends.
when you don't.
I've had several friends talk to me about that problem, like this problem of style, like this question of does it look like a work that does it look like my work? You know what I mean? Like that question.
Yeah, that sort of thought. I feel like it's very much tied to like it's something that comes up a lot when people talk about a body of work. You know, as like over the course of time, it becomes a bit of a thing that some people feel trapped in.
Yeah, I mean what I want is freedom, you know. I just feel like
Mhm.
we are trapped enough as it is to further trap ourselves. That's one of the things I was actually thinking a lot about, for example, in Godhood. Because as I told you, it started as a commission with very specific parameters. So you're given this fragment. Oh, I don't know, almost arbitrarily. I don't know if there was really like a purpose to which artist got what fragment. I don't think there was like a specific reason, or I don't think they tried to match it with someone's, I don't know, personality or work or whatever. Maybe it was like a lottery. I honestly don't know. And so there are the parameters, right? For example, it was a commission to do a zine, and then we were told about the size of the zine or how the zine is constructed. It's a specific size of paper folded a specific way, and we were given like a number of pages to work with. And initially, it was also gonna be just black and white. That's why actually Godhood is black and white, because that was what we were told at first, and then later on we were told you can make it colored now. But at that point, I was already done working with it, so only the cover is colored. But yeah, there's all of these parameters. If you think about it, these parameters are not just present in commissions per se, but in almost every project. Sometimes it's a parameter that has to do with your own skill, or it's a parameter that has to do with, I don't know, how much money you can spend, right? So you're always working with these parameters. And increasingly, that sense of freedom becomes so much more important. Like how do you break free from the parameters while staying within the parameters? And that's a question I thought a lot about in Godhood. How much of the original poet will remain or should remain? And how much of it is me as the artist responding to it, right? So I think these are questions that
Mhm.
I wanted to address in Godhood as a work that fundamentally uses someone else's work. Just relating it to that notion of freedom. I'd like to think there is a visual style that emerges somehow. This is a visual style that also relates to, you know, of course, my sensibilities and how I work and, you know, how I draw, my sense of, I don't know, color, whatever, all these things. But I don't have a rule book for myself. I don't know if others do, but I just know that some painters have like a color palette, or they have the pre-mixed paints. I don't have pre-mixed paints.
Do you think that using objects, the way that you do, does that sort of, yeah, I was asking if like if it adds, if it contributes to the sense of freedom you have in
making things as you do. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think maybe maybe I should circle back to something I said earlier about categories. For example, when I work with certain objects, they usually have, in some cases, they have a function within a narrative. For example, the remedial bequest isn't really a sculpture in the sense that it's not like a sculpture that follows the long tradition of what sculptures have been made for, if you know what I mean. When I make something, for example, when I work with an object, in my mind, it very rarely is, it's very rarely like a proposition for sculpture, or like a like an objet d'art, like a decorative thing that would look fabulous in like a salon. I think when I think about freedom in relation to the objects, I guess on one level maybe I'm thinking about the objects as an extension of the human body, in the same way that the human
Mhm.
body poses many limitations for how the human being can live. We can't be in two places at once, for example. But it also functions as precisely that mechanism by which we can exercise freedom. Like,
Mhm.
because of our body, we can touch other people. Or because of our body, because of our vocal cords, we can speak. Though that's the way I see these objects as an extension of the body. For example, the camera as a parallel to the eye, you know, in a very different way, but in some way, kind of, or for example, the rock as something poses the question of weight in relation to the strength of the body, for example, or water as something that quenches thirst. That's how I think about the objects I
Mhm.
work with, I guess.
So you started with, a lot of objects. We've been talking about objects, and then when you did the limbo triptych up to God, up to Godhood, and Godhood rather, sorry, and also the work that you did with the pink cobra. Like we're starting to look at images, yeah, flat images, things that are not three-dimensional. And this is interesting to me. Like, did you notice that shift?
Yeah, yeah, you're very sharp. the I think at some point, going back to what I said about freedom, right? At some point, I think I thought that
Mhm.
I don't want to be weighed down by stuff.
Hmm.
Or, if, as I said earlier, if I was gonna work with objects, they should supply me with the freedom in the same way that they can function as an extension of myself in some ways. And with those works, I was thinking about that. Like, honestly, Limbo Triptych, for example, they're flat. They're flat, but, like, for example, the Shrine for the Living doesn't even fit in a small car. Like, it just barely fits. So if you book a Grab, it actually almost squishes it.
Oh
Like
my goodness.
like it doesn't fit in a. It's pretty. It's wide. And I don't know. Sometimes I don't like working in that way, honestly. Like, sometimes it's so frustrating when from a mode of art making it becomes a question of logistics. But sometimes I also know the value in going through that process, and what you can achieve when you follow through with all these things. That's very true, for example, with site specific work. Like, the remedial bequest took so much, like maybe 90%, or I don't know, 90% of the remedial bequest had to do with cleaning the place. And then
Mhm.
setting up the thing was relatively fast, disproportionate to how much time it took to clear out the space and think about what to do with all the stuff there. But it was worth it. Though
Mhm.
those invisible things are part of the work, but you don't see it. Even with these works that are, as you describe them, flat and non 3D, I sometimes do think about the invisible aspects of the work that essentially make them good stories. You know what I mean? As narrative objects, like the cobra work as a piece of paper is directly related to a state of wetness, for example, like sugary, sticky wetness, even if the final thing is a mirage, you know. That's actually a word that's a word I borrowed
Mm.
from a friend of mine who wrote beautifully about it. He was saying how the pink the pink sand the pink landscapes were a mirage, and I just felt like, yeah, I mean, I guess that idea of a mirage is relevant to what we are talking about now, because you mentioned image, right? I guess I want to talk about image in relation to mirage, because usually an image is a very the notion of an image has some exactitude to it. But usually when I work with images, it's not really imagery per se in the sense of iconography, though although I do sometimes think about that as well. But there's that other side where imagery functions as a kind of impressionistic other, if that makes sense.
What would you say is the mirage in the Cobra work?
Yeah, I think
The pink Cobra work.
yeah, in a very literal way, the mirage there is exactly the fact that you don't know what it is if you don't know what it is. You know what I mean? I mean, it could easily be watercolor,
Mm.
or I don't know what it could be. But the reality of it is a mirage. I don't know how much from a small piece of paper that's somehow inexplicably pink can possibly lead you, for example, to of the symbology of the energy drink can you actually see there. And my conjecture is not a lot, right? Or there's something about that insidious backstory that draws me to a very almost innocent looking piece of work. There's a part of me that is aware of what the work fails to communicate in terms of, for example, in relation to the beautifully written stuff about it. If you saw these works just completely out of context, like what will it communicate to you?
When I first saw these, like I'm not sure how well, it is called Cobra Series One, but when I first saw them and I saw a Cobra, what I thought that they were, like for one reason or another, was like just like knowing that they were Cobra. What I thought that they were for some reason like microscope slides. Like I mean, there's something interesting here because like you're using like maybe some would say like Cobra as a medium of of paint. No?
Part of that work was really purely experiment.
Mm.
So I've never done it before. Series 1 is the first batch I tried, and that was it. So something I guess in the process attracted me to not knowing exactly how it will turn out. It's different from, you have very clear expectations about how pigment behaves, for example, in acrylic or whatever. So the way that I did Cobra, by dipping the pieces of paper in like a Cobra solution, basically, was more akin to, at least in my mind, photography than painting.
Yeah,
Like
that's what I was thinking as well.
yeah. I mean, personally, I've never done it myself. I I work with film photography, but I've never done the film processing myself. I've seen how it's done. So part of what Cobra is kind of almost doing that choreography of
Mm.
developing film in a dark room and having the same expectations, the expectations being, let's see what image comes out. In this context, the image isn't a photographic image per se, but actually a die. Like a die that ends up looking like an image. That was part of the process behind Cobra. That's why they're also that size, because they're almost like the size of Polaroids.
Mm. What was it like knowing that there's a sense of like mimicry of the motions of you even say like the performance of of development. When you were doing this, were you doing this in a dark room?
No, I was doing it. I was doing it in our dining room.
Mm.
I guess cobra is food. But I guess you say mimicry, but I guess I would describe it more as a parallel movement. In the same way we talked about
Mhm, mhm.
the New Frontiers show as a parallel to a holy pilgrimage. You're almost doing the same movement or doing the same things, but disassociated from the original goals of the original choreography. I guess you could say that.
The sort of parallel choreography, was this something that you like? Did you go into the process sort of intending to, engage in that parallel, or was that something that you realized as you were doing it or after?
Maybe one way to talk about it is, you know how there are a lot of artists who describe themselves as process based, right?
Yeah, that's
um
where I was going.
I never considered myself particularly process based. If I can get out of talking about the process, I will. um but there is a part in the practice where there are certain things that I don't do because I don't like doing them. For example, that's one of the reasons I don't like painting, is because I don't like sitting for a long time looking at the same thing for a long time. But I love looking at painting. I love looking at other people's painting. But I don't see it as something I like doing as a process, even if I love fantasizing about being able to paint nicely. Another example, for example, skateboarding. I like skateboarding even if I'm not great at it, but I like doing it. Like I like doing it as an activity. So that's the extent of my process.
And, since you did mention process thing, like some kinds of work being very process based. When you first sort of thought to do this, was it you sort of kind of trying it out too?
What do you mean?
Like, since it is a dye, and then you are working with like paper, like it's pretty process. Like it's a very process based sort of object.
Yeah, what I originally wanted to do was something closer to like a color field work. Originally, I thought using the red cobra would result to a red thing. Like I didn't know it was gonna be
Mm.
pink. I thought it was gonna be much darker, just redder. Like I wanted to make something red. I thought it was gonna look like blood or something, but it ended up this really soft strawberry color that honestly I wasn't going for. But as with photography, sometimes something else comes out. That very concept of working with the camera, the image you take has to do with how you set up the camera. What settings you use. Like the aperture and the lens and all these things. That's partly why I stuck to the Cobra work, even if it came out differently than what I was expecting. Because it became less of an intentional work, but a work that basically what it reveals is inexperience or lack of knowledge about what actually is gonna come out. It's a very naive work in that sense. So opposite to showcasing skill, what it shows more of is lack of skill or lack of familiarity with what the material will do.
Like there's a freedom there. There's a freedom in the shift. Shifting objects, shifting mediums, shifting into a process even.
Yeah, maybe I'd
Yeah.
like to
And
go back to our earlier discussion about deliberateness, right? I mean, the truth is, I do a bunch of things. Not everything's for exhibition. So the ones the ones that I do show are deliberate, even if they don't come from deliberate origins. If we look at all of the other things I've done that never saw the light of day, I guess that's a different story. Like I don't know what we can unearth there.
actually, that's plenty as well. I think that's a lot. That's something that a lot of artists don't talk about. What you do that doesn't end up getting shown, and how much of that is there?
A lot. It's a lot of drawings, also a lot of photos. I guess that's why I delineate exhibitioning as a practice, you know.
Mhm.
I decided to pursue exhibitioning in 2017, but I've been doing this a lot longer, you know. Like a lot of these things I've been thinking about didn't just start before the first show. But about how much of it is not out in the world, it's really it's a lot, you know. It's a lot of, some are like collaborations that didn't push through, you know. There are those. Some are unfinished scripts for films, right, or notes for films. Some are failed sculptures. There's a lot of those things.
When you decided to exhibit, did that influence the work that you were doing too? Like, did it shift it in any way?
Yes, definitely. Because I think the act of exhibitioning takes into account so many other factors, you know. For example, the exhibit as an event, or the aspect of an audience, especially with site specific work, the aspect of an audience being in the site, that becomes part of the work in a way that a drawing of the work fulfills a different thing. Like the exhibition as an experience is part of the thought process now. That's very much the case with the New Frontiers show. That's why we did the tour, and that's why the sense of space was so important.
And Godhood is again, and like you engage with photography again in Godhood.
The beginnings of Godhood was really a commission to respond to the poetry of Cirilio Bautista, who's a national artist for literature, so he's a poet. I mean, let us not forget what the project so far has been called, right? It's called Immortal Poets. I'm not making a direct connection, but here we have another immortal poet. I mean, he's dead, but his work is very much alive. It makes perfect sense for me as a continuation of the Immortal Poets project because, as I've said, here is another immortal poet, you know?
It's a bit of a happy accident. The binding theme there was the work of another poet.
I mean, of course, you get invited to do a lot of group shows or group exhibitions, you know, things like this. But I mean, of course, I can't do all of them, or some of them are dealing with things that I do not have enough time in relation to the deadline to really get into. But if you have group shows where, you know, there's already this resonant thing inside it that I can immediately relate to.
Yeah, okay. I guess it'd be useful to sort of go into a little bit about Godhood.
So going back to its very beginning, it was a it was a commissioned zine for an exhibition about someone else. So
Yes.
that's what it was. So that's where the zine came from, right? So they were setting up this exhibition about the life and work of this Filipino poet, and what the curators did was look at one of his books called The Trilogy of Saint Lazarus. It was like this epic poetry that starts from like when the Spanish arrived. And I think the narrative of it stretches up till, I think, martial law. I'm not sure. So what they did was divide that book into 20 segments and then give out those segments to 20 artists to make zines from them. I got a part from, I think it's the first part of the trilogy. It's called The Archipelago. So I got a segment of the book. When I was thinking about what to make or what zine to make, at some point I decided I wasn't gonna make like a visual representation of the poetry, because I think ultimately poetry is untranslatable in that way. Or at least I wasn't the visual translator for the job. So I thought what I would do instead was to read it, like literally read it. Read it to someone. The project is subtitled Reading from the Archipelago to an Audience of One. That act of reading poetry to one person became what the work was. The zine that came from it are photos from that exchange. So my decision in the end for how to do the zine was basically to record an instance where there are two figures in the frame. One person is reading the assigned poem to someone else. The entire recording of the fragment was maybe 30 minutes. In order to fit the page requirement, which was originally, I think, 100 pages max, only 100 moments from the recording could fit, or roughly less than 100. Godhood as the zine conceptually contains the entire fragment, but because it's only like 100 pages, it becomes fragments of the fragment. Within the newer fragments, what I hope to do was have it almost function as a new poem. That's what the zine is. When I showed Godhood in Kyoto, there was a new parameter for it. Uh, the new
Mhm.
the new parameter was it had to be to sh- to show work that was going to be shown on a phone and to a Japanese audience.
Mhm.
When I was thinking about work that I could show, I mean, apart from the fact that I was working at Godhood in the same time I was invited to do the Kyoto show, I thought it would be interesting to, because Godhood was shot on two phones, actually three cameras, but anyway, it was shot
Mhm.
on it was
Okay.
shot on a phone. So I thought it would be interesting to put it back to the phone because that's
Mhm.
what the exhibition was calling
Okay.
for. And because it was gonna be for a Japanese audience, I thought I'm gonna work with someone to translate it or translate the fragment that I picked out. So the Kyoto version had Japanese subtitles. What I can talk about Godhood though maybe is its visual composition. Oh, do you want? Maybe I could read to you. Maybe I could read to you like a part of Godhood. I'm sorry, I don't have it with me here, but oh, it's wait. I'll see if it's here in the computer so I can like just read to you like a fragment. I'm not 100% sure, but I think in that group show, Godhood is the longest zine. Because I think other people only did like 8 pages. Like Godhood is like 100 pages. Oh, here, this part, and it says, "You were in the wind, I think, with your hunter's eyes deciphering my tracks, the heaviness in my left soul, why I hesitated by a pond and listened." I mean, I really like that line. So, for example, on those lines, I think I projected an image about friendship somehow. It gave me this image of someone looking on to someone else, and just from their movement, be able to, as it says in the poem, be able to sense a heaviness in their left soul and know exactly why they hesitated. I think that was such evocative imagery for me. That and other parts of the fragment I was given informed the decision to how to visually compose Godhood, or informed how I was gonna make Godhood to begin with. Because my first instinct was to read it and maybe, I don't know, draw something, or but as I said earlier, like after reading it, I thought I'm not the visual interpreter for this job. Like, I didn't want to make a visual parallel to the words. Godhood is not really a visual parallel to the poem itself. Godhood is reading the poem as it is. Another clue that may be helpful in telling you a bit about Godhood were the other titles I was considering for it. So I
Okay.
was after I laid out the zine, I was looking for words within the poem that would be the title of the project. So at one point, it was gonna be "The Men in the Boat" because this was something mentioned in the zine. And in Godhood, there are these two figures basically sitting on a yoga mat, and they look like they were on a raft. So I thought maybe it can be called "The Men in the Boat" because it's two men that look like they were somehow in this boat. Another title I was considering was "The Burden of the Silent Year," like because it's very much a pandemic work. And then another one was "Far Away in a Private Sea," because these two figures look like they're far away somewhere and they're the only ones there. So these were like titles I was considering for to call the work. In the end, it was Godhood. In the end, it was all of these words were from the poem, and Godhood was also a word from inside the poem. I think Godhood just had this sense of being extraneous, being extraneous and at the same time being intimate. Extraneous because this notion of Godhood is one that prescribes morality to society, to the outside world, but also intimate in the sense that it reflects your innermost beliefs, your biases, and your hopes and dreams. So like that notion of godhood, if you were of a more religious predisposition, I guess you could call it like a creator or a lord and savior, right? Or if you were of a more science fiction disposition, this notion of godhood is a very advanced kind of other dimensional civilization that is post-human intelligence or something. So I thought godhood as this tagline for this project was what I wanted to name it because it harks back to everything I've ever done.
Yeah, I read the accompanying text in your portfolio about Godhood, and you mentioned here that you wanted to know if the simple act of reading can inject these words with the personal history and the subjectivities of identity. No, I mean that is interesting because would you say that the two figures there are characters also in a sense, or is it more directly you?
The two figures are not named. If you knew me, you would know that's me. If you didn't know it was me, you won't know that's me. The most
Mhm.
information that the two figures that you can derive from the two figures is maybe their clothes or their appearance. So the figure that reads wears a tie-dye shirt that says Glow Galaxy. I think it says Ultimate Glow Party Extravaganza, something like that. Like like an old t-shirt, and then the other and then the figure being read to is wearing a hoodie that says lover. That's really the, that's really the only information available apart from their physical appearance, right? I did, as I think as a work that as a work that was gonna be shown abroad where no one knows me. I think I also wanted the photography, the photography of self-portraiture and the portrait of someone else to function symbolically, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. On a very basic level, these are two men. You can surmise that they are in this stage of their lives when they're a certain age. They're Asian, I mean, all of these
Mhm.
things. And I'm thinking about as I said, the power of portraiture as a symbolic tool to reflect other things apart from itself. That's also how I thought about Jello's portrait in the Limbo triptych, actually. He's one guy, but in some ways he's also every guy, or a lot of other guys.
Mhm.
And the two figures in Godhood, I hope to function similarly.
Okay.
And if you juxtapose that with the words being read, you begin to get a sense of their relationship, or hopefully the relationship of so many other guys who are close friends, or,
Mhm.
something like that. So they're not, I never thought of us as characters in that way. I remember in the curatorial walkthrough in Kyoto, in the Q&A, someone asked about were the clothes intentional or something like this. They were intentional that I thought about what the characters were wearing also in terms of photography. For example, I knew that we weren't supposed to wear dark clothes because we won't be seen. But also not intentional in a way that those are actually our real clothes. Like
Mhm.
that's what we wear. So again, there's that instead of delineating fiction from reality, maybe I wanna highlight more of a reality and a hyper reality.
Mhm.
The hyper reality exists more universally. The reality is more particular, and they exist at the same time.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, we were talking earlier about say tennis, right? And
Yeah.
how we root for these guys, for example. They're real people, but at the same time, they're characters.
Mhm.
I guess it's the same thing here, if that makes sense.
And again, like I'm really like observing some really interesting like progressions because here like your work it's another work where you're handling like a human person, which again like it shows up, and like I mean, what right before that it was, and it's actually it's interesting every time like
like a human person in, like a character, as a portrait, as what have you. It's interesting every time it shows up. There's a narrative here too, in a sense. Like there's a story being told, like with the figures. In fact, it's actually quite interesting that you've referred to them as figures, and that's why I kind of brought up the character thing to sort of probe
Yeah.
into that.
I guess I'm also thinking about, like, for example, the showing this abroad to strangers. I don't have friends in Japan that I know of, you know. I don't think they'll see me exactly. They'll what they'll see is two figures. That's
Mhm.
why that's why I refer to them as that. And just, I guess, compositionally speaking,
Mhm.
this is also a work that I just thought about this earlier, like as we were talking, like Godhood and Compost, which are 3 years apart, are lit the same way with like
Okay.
one bulb. Yeah, Godhood was lit with a stronger light, but there's that aspect of looking at light. I just remember, there's another line from the extract given to me. The line goes something like, "The curse of light, more real in darkness." What does it mean? I don't know, but I think I began to think about the element of light, not only within Godhood, but throughout the the body of work. Part 3, Miller's Planet, in the documentaries in Miller's Planet, is also lit the same way. It's partly about attempting to extract images in low light. That's one.
Yeah, is there a reason that you you try to do that, extracting images in low light, since it's something that recurs?
I have this I have this I have this relationship with light that I sometimes find difficult to explain or describe. For example, sometimes I dream of moments lit a certain way. I don't know if that makes sense. Or
Mm.
I have memories of certain afternoons where it's a very particular yellow. For example, I remember that scene in Inception where Marion Cotillard woke up from like a really I think she woke up from a nap, and then it was like late in the afternoon, and she didn't know if she was dreaming or not, and that kind of started her madness. But I remember it was like bathed in this very deep yellow sunlight. And when I think of home, when I think of the house I grew up in, I also have a memory of how the house was lit, and how different places have different kinds of light. Just as an example, I remember when I was a kid, the first time I've been to the Peninsula, Manila, the hotel, I was in awe. I was like, wow, like there's like a sun in the ceiling. And that light was so particular,
Mhm.
It was such a particular kind of it was a particular kind of light, and it was a light from childhood. I've been there many times again, and it's different. It's somehow the same, but at the same time, it can't be replicated. So I think it becomes less a fact of light, but kind of like a memory of light, or light
Mhm.
that passed through the sift of memory, of innocence, and all these other things. When I work with light in my own work, it's coming from that place. It's coming from that place of grappling with light as a mystery, or sometimes trying to replicate light and failing. For example, with the remedial bequest, we did the tour in a very specific time frame. It was like around 4:30. Like I think what we did was we observed the previous days, how light behaves in that spot in particular times. So that's when we decided to do the tour in this particular time slot, because that's how the light lit the place. If you were a few minutes earlier or a few minutes later, it looks different. That's why I remember from Instagram, some people who Instagrammed the work, the place was bathed in like this this yellow. It was like so yellow, because that was the time we planned to show it then. And then there were some photos when it was almost too dark, because because it was gonna be nighttime. So I work with light in that way, not only as a function of display, but almost using as human memory as a vessel for the light, if that makes sense. Among the people who went to the New Frontiers show, for example, everyone saw the same sculpture, but I feel like everyone saw a different light. And because of that,
Mhm.
in people's memory, it's different works.
Interesting. Godhood, like it starts out as a print thing that you do like flip through. When it was exhibited in Kyoto, that's when it sort of became a slideshow of of the original work. Like how do you feel about that shift, like from something you kind of have to have a hand in turning the pages for to something that sort of moves on its own.
At least part of the plan for the zine was Jerry, the curator, opened the possibility of it being able to be downloadable. So
Mhm.
people can print it or make copies on their own. I thought if that was the case, apart from being a zine that you can flip through like a physical thing, then it's also going to be like a PDF, like it's also going to be like a digital file. And when you go through the PDF, it actually looks like a slideshow anyway. So it wasn't really that big of a shift. The bigger shift was the Japanese translation, I think. But in
Okay.
terms of it being a print thing and like a video, the shift wasn't so huge.
Let's talk about that. The fact that there are Japanese subtitles. First, like this is drawn from a poem of a national artist. It's written in English. That's so many things going on. Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's a Filipino artists interpreting different parts of a poem that's written in English. It ends up going to Japan, where it's given like Japanese subtitles. So like there's what's happening. Like you're right. There's much more shift in the context in which it's received in that sense.
That's part of what motivated me to do it, the national artist thing, because basically what I imagined happening was this was really gonna be butchered somehow,
Mm.
and and I was like, yeah, whatever, you know what I mean. So,
Yeah.
not I I don't because I don't want to seem disrespectful because I really like the poem,
Mm.
but I thought it's kind of like I wanna bridge this great divide between national artists and like memes. You know what I
Mm.
mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so actually what I did there was I worked with a friend of mine who wasn't really a professional translator. He's actually a
Mm.
DJ. So,
Okay.
he's not like a literary scholar, which I thought was another fascinating layer to it. But what I did was from the original fragments, I didn't give that exactly to him. I actually did a provisional translation. The original text, I made another translation based on the text, and then that was what was translated into Japanese. There were some things I actually changed. Like I don't think it's very accurate to say that the Japanese text is actually a translation of Cyrillio's original words because I changed a few things. Not a lot of things, but a few things.
Mm. This is not really like an accurate term, but it's like a localization. And same with it, you don't like when video games get exported to different countries. You don't have like an exact translation. You do have to like there is a context consideration. That's a fascinating thing because translation in and of itself, like it's a whole process that takes into consideration so many of these different things.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
I
and
remember
that's interesting.
watching
Like it's
this.
like a how.
Sorry, I was just gonna share that I remember watching this YouTube video about the different translations of Harry Potter and how
Mhm.
I don't remember exact examples, but how like I mean there are certain terms that doesn't cross over so well from British English to Norwegian or something. For me, that's so interesting. It's almost a test imposed on authorial intent, and I'm interested in this idea of ownership. What do we own, or what can we claim ownership to? I was thinking the same thing about the rocks, right? Like, do I own them? Do I not own them? So yeah, these are things I think about a lot.
Particularly fascinating with the Godhood. You are borrowing a text from like a writer, and like an interpretation is, the question of ownership comes in too, and the fact that it's translated, it just expands. You say it's something that you think about a lot. Borrowing and ownership, like with the rocks, and with these words, interpretations, and like it was present in rock, in the rock catalog, it's present in Godhood. Is this Is this something that you see yourself like exploring further?
Someone actually asked me during the Q&A in Kyoto if this was the first time I used someone's text in my work. I said yeah, like this is the first time I did it. But I realized that's not true. Like I have another work where a work called choreography where there's an audio channel that's a text to speech recording of the Gospel of St. John.
I remember that one.
That would have been the first, I think. It was written by John the Evangelist. And in that work, it's also being read, not by me, but by like the computer. Godhood wasn't the first time that I did it. I can't say to what extent that particular sensibility will show up. That notion of ownership is also important to me, not only in the sense of like borrowing texts and things like this, but the ownership of culture as a people with a colonized history, how we engage with that history of colonialization and all of everything that's attached to that. It is a very tumultuous space that is fundamentally difficult to deal with. But as I said, being discouraged should not translate to being shackles because then the cycle just repeats. And I don't want, and I hate feeling that way, you know? I hate feeling that there's stuff I can't do. And so the work now becomes about resistance. It becomes a practice of what can I say is mine. The idea, one of the ideas in Godhood was when I read this poem, how much of it is now mine? You know, am I now part national artist? Of course, the answer is no, because you have to wait for the government to tell you that you deserve it. You know, you have to wait for other forces greater than you to give you that name. But my point is, I don't care. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want anyone to tell me who I am and who I am not. I want the work to reflect that.
It's something so inane if you think about it, but it's a healthy way to it's a healthy and good way to sort of approach work as an artist. You know, to just
Yeah.
explore those kinds of interests, because these sort of Wikipedia runs, the Wikipedia rabbit holes that we get into, like inform so much of the work that we do, and it's I feel like for a lot of younger artists who are sort of just getting into the whole thing, they're presented with so many pressures because of ideas, popular ideas surrounding what art making is in this day and age.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, Wikipedia rabbit holes. I often do think about how much of that is essentially, characteristic of a generation. Accessing information in that way with such immediacy, with such readiness, and also with such infinite hyperlinking of ideas. We know from observing history that people within history are oblivious of it. This is something I think a lot about in my work. I guess you can describe it as a kind of hyper consciousness about our place in time. And also sometimes the alienation that comes from that. Sometimes feeling that you're observing what's happening around you from a distance, but in fact, you're embroiled in that hot, boiling, bubbling soup of incongruencies and this mix of things, both suffering and inordinate amounts of pleasure that for some reason can exist in one place. It's somehow hard to understand how that's even possible. And it does make you think about where you are, who you are, and your place in that whole cosmology. These are things that I think about, and I don't know honestly to what extent it crops up in the work in a effectively communicable way. But if you were to ask me, what's at the crux of the project, maybe it's these things. It's hard to describe, but I think it comes from a place of just trying to figure things out and trying to make the confusion, instead of paralyzing, trying to make it generative, as a synonym for creativity, right?
Like, so your work, it certainly feels very much is, exploratory. There's a lot of going into things sort of undefined and discovering, in the process of making. No? I feel like the popular idea surrounding, the attitude toward art making is that you are kind of there to sort of create a product. I think that's what prevails. At least, maybe the way that people who aren't necessarily engaged in art kind of see it, like you're making a thing.
I agree with you that a lot of the work is a kind of exploration. I think for me, like how do you say it? Like, for me, art making is like a profession of faith, and each work is like an article of faith. Each work contains everything you believe in, condensed into one tiny thing, whether that thing be an object or a gesture or a photograph. That's why I said you really can't help but be vulnerable, because I honestly don't think you can hide anything when you make art. Or going back to our earlier conversation about the notion of barricades and reliquaries and dusted canopies, these are all gestures to hide something, but I honestly don't think they hide anything more than they give you additional information that something is being hidden. Because I think it's in art, it's impossible to hide anything. That's really what I think. Everything comes out in ways unexpected and sometimes maybe upsetting, sometimes maybe, I don't know, satisfying or fulfilling or fun. When it's fun, it's great, right?
Yeah. Like how many artists actually talk about how fun this is? Like, do we use that word much often? And if fun isn't the right word, there is joy in the process, and there is, that sort of, there's that tick.
Yeah.
I mean,
Juxtaposing that notion of fun with unfun things we've talked about earlier, right? Like grief or death. I mean, obviously, these aren't fun things, or talking about them isn't fun per se. But I think every small achievement is a humble achievement in a way. Being able to, yeah, I'm finding it difficult to make the connection. But when you're dealing with trauma, for example, or when you're dealing with the suffering of others, it's not fun, right? It's not like that's not the point. But when you are able to, that achievement, however humble or however small, is a step toward the right direction. I'm totally content if the body of work is a series of these steps, because I can't really predict the future, right? I mean, I can kind of like have a vision for the kind of world I want to live in, but ultimately you go about that in ways that you know how, and in every small decision you try to make the right one, and that's the most you can do at any given time, I think.
okay, I was actually trying to lead into that question. Actually, now that I think about it, since I might as well just jump into it. What is it that fuels the impulse for you to make?
You know what? That's such a tough question because, of course, it really makes you look at yourself and try to say as best or communicate as best you can what your intentions are, what your motivations are. The thing is, for me, what art does to the world, it's definitely more difficult to describe or outline, because if you're talking, for example, purely about people, there's billions of us. But I know what art does to me, right? How working in this way, what it does to me at least. And I know what it does to me is it gives me an on one level like an avenue to exercise freedom. That's one. I don't know if it's just like as an artist or as a human being, you always want to communicate. One of the worst feelings in the world is feeling alone. I just remember there's something Steinbeck said. It goes something like, out of loneliness, we're trying to send signals out to a distant star. Something like this. That's true. It's like as a human being, you always want to be communicating, you want to tell people stuff, you want to hear stuff from other people. Art then becomes the question of how you do that, because sometimes it's not just words, it's not just gestures, sometimes it's a site specific installation, sometimes it's a video, and I think ultimately that's where it all comes from, this feeling of being trapped and wanting to be free, and attempting to find ways how to break free from everything that's pulling you back on a very general level. That's where it comes from. But I think as long as the human being is alive and life goes through its ups and downs and its, the vicissitudes of life, the constancy of change, in terms of art, in terms of themes or concepts or whatever, those are also constantly in flux. What is unchanging is that need to communicate with other people. Just to remind yourself that you're not alone, and then also to remind other people that they're also not alone. Yeah.
Yeah, that answers the question, certainly.
I wonder if that's like the
Okay.
outro, no? Maybe we can attempt to smoothly outro out of this. Like maybe we can play like a piece of music that I like starting
Yes,
right
oh my
about
God.
now.